Hi, everyone. I'm Elise Vincenti, Publicity and Marketing Manager at Peachtree, and welcome to our virtual event in preparation for Constitution Day. For this event, co-authors Cynthia and Sanford Levinson will be discussing some of today's most pressing topics, including COVID-19, protests, and the upcoming election, and how these issues affecting us today are related to the creation of the U.S. Constitution. They will also be answering questions about their book, Fault Lines in the Constitution, the Framers, Their Fights, and the Flaws That Affect Us Today, as well as answering questions from viewers. If you have any comments or questions during this event, please feel free to add them to the comments section and the Ask a Question section below. Also, you will find a link in the comments to a Google Doc where you can use the outline provided to follow along and take notes for your own use. After this event, the video will be available for you to use with your students for any lessons you have planned for Constitution Day, which is this Thursday, September 17th. Now for a little bit about each of our guests tonight. First, our co-authors, Cynthia and Sandy Levinson. Cynthia Levinson holds degrees from Wellesley College and Harvard University, and also attended the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. A former teacher and educational policy consultant and researcher, she is the author of award-winning and critically acclaimed nonfiction books about social justice, including We've Got a Job, the 1963 Birmingham Children's March, The Youngest Marcher, the story of Audrey Faye Hendricks, a young civil rights activist, Watch Out for Flying Kids, How Two Circuses, Two Countries, and 9 Kids Confront Conflict and Build Community, and many others. Sanford Levinson has taught in both the law school and the Department of Government at the University of Texas for almost 40 years and is a regular visiting professor at the Harvard Law School. He holds degrees from Duke, Stanford, and Harvard universities and is the author of several books for adults on the Constitution and writes frequently for a variety of newspapers, magazines, and blogs. And our Q&A moderator this evening is Mary Ellen Daneels. Mary Ellen is a national board certified teacher who has taught at West Chicago Community High School for 27 years. For the past 3 years, she has served as the lead teacher mentor for the Robert R. McCormick Foundation, leading efforts to support the implementation of the high school civics mandate and Illinois social science standards. A member of the Illinois Civic Mission Coalition, Mary Ellen has advocated for civic education before federal and state lawmakers. She also served on the board of directors for the National Council of the Social Studies and worked on the task force to revise the Illinois Social Studies standards. So without further ado, let's get started. Let me bring on Cynthia and Sandy, and I'll pass it along to them.
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being with us. We really appreciate it. Elise, is Mary Ellen joining us now or in a few minutes?
In a few minutes. This is for your presentation.
Okay. You also have, thanks to Elise, you have a Google Doc which you can follow along with as we talk about things, just to help you keep track. We want to thank Peachtree Publishers very much for arranging this, and Mary Ellen has been superlative. So, as Elise mentioned, Sandy and I wrote this book, Fault Lines in the Constitution. Sandy, do you want to give a little bit of a background overview for it?
Sure. The title is really important, and I think it actually might have been suggested by Kathy Landwehr,
our editor at Peachtree.
Editor at Peachtree. The term fault lines, as I'm sure most of you know, is a geological term, and it refers to tectonic plates deep underneath the surface that most of the time we ignore. But when the plates move, they can wreak havoc. I speak personally on that because I went to law school at Stanford, which is literally on top of the San Andreas Fault. And you can't live there unless you basically deny the reality of the San Andreas Fault or believe that the big one, which will come sooner or later, will come after you leave, which in fact, hasn't come yet. We had 3 very happy years in Palo Alto. So what our book focuses on are the tectonic plates of the Constitution that are often quite ignored. They are the structural features that I have come to believe are almost literally incredibly important. But more and more, we, and by we, I include people who teach at law schools across the country, tend to ignore. But if the plates move, they can really wreak havoc. And that is really what our book is about.
What we're going to be talking about today are some aspects of those structural fault lines, particularly as they relate to current events, the events in your lives and your students' lives that are probably most on their minds right now. We'll get to 3-ish of them that Elise mentioned, but the book, in fact, deals with 20 fault lines. Some of them are things, as Sandy says, that we tend to take for granted, like bicameralism, the U.S. Senate, presidential powers. Some of the things that we just don't think about all that much. The District of Columbia, for instance, and the fact that it's not a state. But we're going to focus, as I said, on 3-ish of those fault lines tonight. And they are Constitution and how it relates to COVID-19. You want to pick up the next one?
Protests.
Right, protests that are going on now. And the election that's upcoming. So the relationship between those issues and fault lines in the Constitution. Let's see, I think I'm talking about...
Right, so I'll start on COVID-19.
Yeah, okay.
I have to say, I'm very proud of the book, which was initially written in 2016, and then there was a revised edition that came out last year, because in fact, we spotted the issue of pandemics, that like earthquakes, pandemics happen. And like earthquakes, we often want to deny that, but in part because our son-in-law is an epidemiologist at the Harvard School of Public Health. We've been thinking about pandemics literally as long as he's been in Cambridge, which was about 20 years ago. So we talk about Ebola. I think we might refer to the so-called Spanish flu of 1919. But what we point out in a chapter on emergency powers is the Constitution well equipped to respond to emergencies. That one kind of emergency is a public health pandemic. And various things can come up. And the question is whether the Constitution is very helpful or very precise as to what can be done. So let's simply begin with the issue of what about being quarantined or isolated? The Constitution speaks of the blessings of liberty. And a lot of people will say, well, a blessing of liberty is that you can basically do whatever you want, and the government can't tell you to be quarantined, can't tell you to be isolated. And that's right. At one level, if you read the Constitution, you find nothing about that. There is a little bit of reference to emergencies, and Cynthia will talk more about that than I will, about suspension of habeas corpus in times of rebellion and invasion, or insurrection and invasion. And so one question is metaphorical. Is a virus invading us? And if so, does that trigger certain kinds of emergency powers? But there's also something we talk about in the book, which is delegation by Congress of vast, vast powers to the president and to agencies like the CDCP. And so the question is, well, does the Constitution authorize them to say that we have to be quarantined and isolated? And there's one other point, I won't go into it at length, but what about your freedom as an American to travel from state to state? We are, after all, the United States of America. And from very early on, that was thought to mean that if you lived in New Jersey, you just could cross the Hudson into New York and vice versa. But can Rhode Island, for example, refused to let in automobiles with New York license plates because New York was a hot spot and Rhode Island wanted to protect itself. Constitution isn't clear on that.
So Sandy has raised the first of two questions that you might talk about with your students. That is, must you be quarantined? If the government, the federal government or state government required it, but in this case we're talking about the federal government because it's the US Constitution, forced everybody to be quarantined, must you abide by it? Every chapter in our book starts with a story, and we tell the story of an infectious disease nurse named Casey Hickox, who was working in West Africa with Ebola patients in 2014. Bad luck for her, she returned to New Jersey the very day that New Jersey Governor Chris Christie established a mandatory quarantine for people who had symptoms of Ebola, which she did not, but somebody took her temperature wrong, and she was basically incarcerated in a tent in a hospital parking lot, and she sued. And her suit was based on, as Sandy said, the right or the great writ of habeas corpus.
Which means basically that the state or government cannot hold you, it cannot detain you unless they give a good reason. And is the simple suspicion that you might be a danger a good enough reason?
Right. So the other question, in addition to must you be quarantined, that your students may well have questions about in relationship to the Constitution and COVID is, must you, when there's a vaccine, must you be vaccinated? Recent polls show that somewhere between a third and a half of the US population is opposed to vaccines of all kinds. And of course, as you know, there are issues these days about how quickly a vaccine will come out. Will it be safe when it comes out? How soon will you have to be vaccinated? Well, we didn't write about this specifically in the book, but we do blog about the book every month. We blog updates, and I'll give you that website. And in a very recent blog, we talk about a man named Jacobson, who in response to smallpox in 1900,
1905.
1905, thank you, refused mandatory smallpox vaccination in the state of Massachusetts because, in fact, he had been vaccinated previously for smallpox and got very sick from the vaccination. It contained all kinds of detritus in it, because they didn't know about infectious diseases then, and he sued. He lost the suit and went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. What he said was, we have on our books a law that compels a man to offer up his body to pollution and filth and disease. And he claimed that he could avoid the vaccine, first of all, by I call it a bullet point in the preamble, the blessings of liberty, as Sandy referred to, and also due process, that he hadn't been given due process of law to refuse to be forced to take the vaccine. The Supreme Court ruled, though, that the common good required him to be vaccinated. So that's the first issue we want to talk about.
Yeah, I would just say one quick thing. We spend quite a bit of time talking about the preamble, which both of us think is a wonderful, wonderful part of the Constitution, but at certain points, it's in tension with itself, because the preamble says that the point of the Constitution is to provide for the general welfare, but it also says it's to secure the blessings of liberty. And in Jacobson, what the court said is that the general welfare required the infringement of liberty. And that's what we're debating about today. People who make libertarian arguments aren't stupid. They can cite the preamble, but there is also something called the general welfare.
The second issue, what's going on today in terms of protests in the streets, protests in cities, how does that relate to the Constitution? Well, again, there are two questions that we're raising for you today that I'm sure in your students' minds that you should be able to talk with them about, or you can. One is, what can you say and when can you say it? And the other is, what can you do? How does that relate to the Constitution?
Right. And again, this comes up for us in the chapter on emergency powers. What if the nation is at war? Metaphorically or in a more direct sense, can one lose one's liberty? So we focus on Eugene V. Debs, who had run for president in 1912, got almost 1 million votes. He was a major political figure. He gave a speech in Canton, Ohio in 1917, I think, opposing American entry into World War I. For that, he was tried and convicted by the US government, sent to jail for 10 years. And the Supreme Court unanimously upheld that, and Justice Holmes said something to the effect, when a nation is at war, you can't really expect it to give people their ordinary liberties. Warren Harding, who is usually not viewed among our better presidents, Warren Harding, when he became president, commuted Eugene Debs' sentence and invited him to visit him at the White House, which Debs did. So I have a soft spot in my heart for Harding, but it really touches on the fact that during times of crisis, the courts may be all too willing to accept certain kinds of infringements on liberty if people really go after what government wants to do.
Then the second question, what are you allowed to do? What does the Constitution say you can or cannot do? Well, this relates to two other books that Elise mentioned that I wrote about children who, let's see, maybe We've Got a Job and The Youngest Marcher. Children who reacted purposefully, breaking the law in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963 in order to protest segregation. So what can you do? Well, you're not allowed to break the law. The children's sponsors basically filed for a parade permit to allow them to march. The city of Birmingham, of course, denied the permit. The children, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 of them, decided to ignore that purposely, to break the law and to go to jail in order to fill up the jails on purpose, to break the back of the criminal justice system, justice in quotation marks, in Birmingham in the early 1960s. So it's important for students to be very aware when they're breaking the law, when they're not, and when they decide to do it for tactical or strategic purposes, but also to know what the results will be. Because, for instance, Audrey Faye Hendricks, a 9-year-old, was jailed for a week during that time.
I mean, I don't think anybody would justify every single civil disobedience movement that's taken place over the last 225 years. But you can't understand the American Revolution without the Boston Tea Party, which was absolutely and completely illegal. You can't understand the civil rights movement in the United States without being attentive to what Cynthia wrote about. And then there were and are extraordinarily unattractive people who violate the law to protest something they don't like. And this can certainly be discussed and argued about at length.
So rapidly moving forward on to the third issue, the elections that are coming up. Again, we raise a couple of questions here that directly relate to the Constitution. Who can vote? How do you know? That's one set of questions. And then there's that bugaboo, what about that Electoral College? So the New York Times recently actually published a map of how easy or hard it is to vote in various states. It was color-coded and it was really multiply complex, because what the founders did, the framers did, was to decide, they basically punted the decision about election laws. They decided they were getting near to the end of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and they said, this is too complicated, we're a federal system, we're gonna let the states decide how to run even not only state elections, but also the presidential elections. So in some states you can vote by mail and in some you can't. And in some states you have to vote by mail. And in some states, like as in Texas, where we live most of the year. You can vote by mail either if you're a certain age or if you're sick, but you have to show that you're sick. It's very, very complicated. Every state also differs according to residency requirements, registration procedures, ID requirements, the number and placement of polling places, and when they're open and when they're not. It's very complicated and frankly kind of crazy. But I really want Sandy to be talking about the Electoral College as well, because I know that that's something you are all going to care a lot about.
Yeah, though I do want to underline the importance of the point that Cynthia makes, that there are no national elections in the United States. There are elections for national office, but every election is run by the state. And one can ask if that's a good idea in the 21st century, but it is the reality of the American electoral system, and it has to do with federalism. With the Electoral College, I think that the longest single chapter in the book is on the Electoral College. There are a number of things you know about the Electoral College. The first thing is that it was made part of the Constitution literally in the last week or two because they really couldn't figure out how to elect the president. Some people wanted the president to be chosen by Congress. Other people, but very few people, wanted a national election. James Madison, toward the very end, came up with this idea, and everybody was eager to get out of Philadelphia, and they said, okay. So they have the Electoral College. It broke down spectacularly in 1800. We almost went to civil war when Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr tied in the Electoral College, and the House of Representatives on a one state, one vote basis on the 36th ballot chose Thomas Jefferson. Now, one of the things students really ought to know, adults ought to know, is that the Electoral College is not merely the fact that we don't have a nationwide popular vote and that we elect presidents because each state allocates votes. It's also a process whereby the votes are allocated, except in Maine and Nebraska, on a winner-take-all basis. So in California, I think it's something like 55 electoral votes go to whoever comes in first. That means that if 45% of the California electorate votes Republican, they get 0 in the Electoral College. Since 1816, there have been protests against the winner-take-all feature. We still have it. But we're not done yet, because what if the Electoral College doesn't choose a winner, as has happened most notably in 1800? Then in 1824, it does go to the House. The so-called contingent election is the House picks, and Wyoming has the same say in picking a president as California. Again, since 1816, people have thought this is crazy, but we got it. Every single poll since 1944 has shown that a majority of the American people would like to get rid of the Electoral College. So why do we have it? And that links with another major fault line, which is the sheer difficulty of constitutional amendment. And it's especially difficult when you've got these 3 or 4 balls that have to be juggled. It's not just one thing. If we were getting rid of winner take all, or if it were getting rid of other single features of the Electoral College, maybe we could have done it. But we have to put all of these together in one ball of wax. And for 200 years now, people have been bitter critics of the Electoral College, and nothing has happened.
Right. So Sandy mentioned a few minutes ago reference to the preamble. You'll notice in the Google Doc that Elise prepared that we have a report card of the Constitution, which has in it, as I say, what I call the bullet points, including the blessings of liberty, but also the others, you know, form a more perfect union and that sort of thing. We think of this was Sandy's really brilliant idea, as the rubric your teachers. You all know what rubrics are. I'm sure your students do too. The rubric for the Constitution. So just based on these three issues alone that we've just talked about, protests, COVID-19, and elections, you might give thought to what grade would you give the Constitution as they relate to the preamble, the purposes for which the Constitution was written. Be an interesting exercise to do with your students. Now, we don't want to leave everybody morose this evening and thinking that there's nothing to be done. I'm going to fall through the cracks of the fault lines. No, you're not. So as Sandy mentioned, the Constitution can be amended. Now, at the beginning, I said we're going to talk about three-ish fault lines. We have, in a way, the fourth one is amending the Constitution, and the sort of wind-up chapter is on Phyllis Schlafly and her success in preventing the Equal Rights Amendment from passing. It's a very, very difficult process to amend the Constitution. Not impossible. A college student actually managed, and we have information about a college student in the book who managed to get an amendment passed. But what about other ways of changing the Constitution? Well, we have a debate in the book on whether or not to hold another constitutional convention as like the first one in 1787. Do you want to give a very quick recap of your view?
Yeah, I very much believe the Constitution needs revision. I am not an admirer of the current Constitution in terms of its consequences on our everyday lives. I also believe that the only way to get effective change is through a new constitutional convention.
And I think, oh my goodness, let us not have that. I'm afraid not only of what might happen at a convention, but even before we get there, how would we choose the delegates? And would it be one state, one vote? Or how would we allocate the proportions, and which people will be elected, and how diverse would they be? And just to get the whole thing rolling, I think just kind of makes me fall over in a faint.
Yeah. Let me say very quickly, I think there are two big reasons to oppose the convention. One of them is the fear of the so-called runaway convention. And I have very good answers for that I won't go into. The other objection is Cynthia's, which I think is much, much more serious, because one of the fault lines in the Constitution, it turns out, is not only that it's difficult to amend, but although it mentions the possibility of a constitutional convention in Article 5, it doesn't give you the slightest clue as to how to answer the questions that Cynthia asks. And she's probably right that we would be at each other's throats on these very basic procedural issues.
So there are still things that can be done, and that your students can do as well, and we outline a number of them in the book. One of them is speak up. Just speak about these problems so people become aware of them. Now, in the Google Doc, there's a cute graphic that says speak up with a microphone. That comes from this book right here, which, as you see, is also called Fault Lines in the Constitution. This is the graphic novel, and we are very, very excited that it will be coming out on September 22nd. And you have in the Google Doc also some examples of the illustrations by Ali Shwed in that book. And in fact, there is one set of illustrations related to protests, one set of illustrations related to the Electoral College, and one set related to, in fact, Casey Hickox, the Ebola nurse, although she hated being called the Ebola nurse. So that'll give you an idea of the book, and we're grateful to Peachtree for licensing Macmillan First Second Publishing to allow that book to happen. We blog about the book, as I mentioned. You can get to the blog either from the Fault Lines in the Constitution.com website or from my website, CynthiaLevinson.com. And also on my website, there are links to further resources, lots of activities for teachers, discussion guides by Ed Sullivan and and by Robbie Cohen at New York University. And there are also links to materials, teacher-student materials for the graphic novel version. and to our blog. Did I say that? Oh, but one very final thing that's really important for everybody to do, and please help your students who are eligible become registered to vote.
Yep.
Okay. Phew.
All right. Well, that was quite a bit for all of us to process. Thank you for that great overview. And we have some wonderful questions for the both of you. So I'm just going to pause and see if you need to take a sip of water before we get on to the Q&A section. Before we started this webinar, we did ask participants what topic they would like to spend the most time with. And they said voting and elections. So I think we'll start there with some follow-up questions, if you don't mind. My friend Ashley from the iCivics Ed Network wanted to ask you, what is your opinion on the recent rulings related to faithless electors?
I think the court got it dreadfully wrong, but I'm probably a minority. The term itself is interesting. If you agree with the decision, you probably like the term faithless elector, because a faithful elector will simply mimic the preferences of the electorate. And what could be more democratic than that? If one is skeptical about the decision, as I am, one will use the term Hamiltonian elector and cite Federalist 68, in which Alexander Hamilton defends the Electoral College on the basis that it will serve as an all-important filter that will protect us from ever having a demagogue as president. The people who wrote the Constitution of 1787 were not filled with great faith in the electorate. So, and they knew their Roman history, et cetera, et cetera. They thought it was very, very important to have a guardrail. And the original purpose of the Electoral College was to serve as a guardrail. It's extremely difficult to figure out what the purpose of the Electoral College today is, other than to give inordinate power to battleground states. But what the Supreme Court did in its July decision is basically simply ignore any of the Hamiltonian defense of the Electoral College and basically say that electors are supposed to be mindless. That's my take on the decision. But as I said, I'm probably a minority.
But I join Sandy in that minority.
As a follow-up to that, there was also a question let me see here, from Charles about the National Popular Vote Bill that many people are discussing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the National Popular Vote Initiative responds wonderfully to 2016, because what it says is that if you come in first, you ought to become president. Very sensible argument, except for the fact that you can come in first without getting anywhere near a majority. So think of 3 presidents. Abraham Lincoln got 39.8% of the popular vote, became president. He had a civil war. Bill Clinton had 43%. Actually, Richard Nixon had 43% of the popular vote in 1968, and Bill Clinton had 43% of the popular vote in 1992. My own belief is that anybody who becomes president should be able to make not only a plausible, but a kind of demonstrable argument that he or she has the support of the majority of the American people. The fair vote proposal basically elides the problem of majority rule because they concentrate entirely on 2000 and now 2016.
We talk about workarounds to the Electoral College in the book. And we also talk about ranked choice voting, which would be a way of getting closer to a true majority. If there's merely a plurality for a winning candidate, and you want to get a majority, then ranked choice voting, which we describe in the book and also include in discussion materials on my website and Peachtree's website, explain how that would work.
Yeah, there used to be the expression, as Maine goes, so goes the nation. Well, we might valuably return to that in this respect. Maine, in fact, has led the way in adopting ranked choice voting. A lot of people say, oh, ranked choice voting is much too hard for ordinary people to understand. It's not rocket science. And the people of Maine have conducted elections now with ranked choice voting and have done a fine job in figuring out how to list their preferences 1, 2, and 3. And the whole country could do it.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. Moving on a little bit to the now what section of your book, Kim would like you, I think, Sandy, to unpack a little bit more about the voting power in the Senate and some of your suggestions for reforming that part in the now what section.
Yeah,
so
Cynthia,
was that directed to, was Kim directing?
Either of you, really.
Oh,
okay.
Well, Sandy and I are not infrequently asked what is our either most favorite or least favorite fault line in the book. I came to the conclusion, the Electoral College is a problem, but from my perspective, I think the Senate is actually the greatest problem, and that's so basic to the structure, system of government that we have because of the inequities. There's actually a fair amount of math in the book, mostly related to proportionality. And if you think about the state of Rhode Island or Delaware or Maine, compared to, say, Texas or New York or California, the fact that every state has 2 votes in the Senate just makes no sense. I want to be sure I'm responding, though, to Kim's question. Is that the question that Kim was asking?
She was asking if you could explain a little bit more about your plan for reforming that voting.
Well, I mean, that's a terrific question, in part because it is next to impossible to come up with a plan, given that the poison pill in the Constitution comes at the end of Article 5, which says that basically equal voting power in the Senate is guaranteed forever and ever. So that the plan is a constitutional convention that develops enough legitimacy among the public because they see it on television. They develop a confidence in the delegates that they're not crazy. They really are trying to figure out how we should organize ourselves for the 21st century. And people who demand respect, who command respect, will point out how crazy it is to give Wyoming with 550,000 people the same voting power as California with about 40 million people. But some of these things, we can come up with a plan because, one can imagine legislation or one can imagine a freestanding constitutional amendment. With the Senate, you go to the heart of the matter. James Madison wrote that the Senate was a necessary evil. I want to focus on both the adjective and the noun. He thought it was evil because there was no defense of giving Virginia and Delaware, which is then the smallest state, equal power. It was necessary because we wouldn't have had a constitution without the so-called Great Compromise. The same is also true, though, of compromise with slavery. There's no difference in terms of understanding the politics of the convention.
Sandy's true, right, that the plan may be an optimistic way to describe it. We do have suggestions in the book about the Senate. For instance, we suggest simply expanding the size of Congress by having elder statespeople, for instance, retired Supreme Court justices or presidents or other people who might at least fill the seats and potentially the voting rolls, depending on how it might come to pass, to make the Senate more representative, at least.
Oh, there's one other plan, which is, it's an academic joke in a way, but pass a constitutional amendment, which would be perfectly legitimate, saying that the Senate continues to exist, but the only thing it will do is confirm ambassadors. Oh. And then if you like the idea of a second house, which I do, I'm not opposed to bicameralism per se, then let's construct a brand new House that will have very broad powers and be elected reasonably. But that would be the academic plan to neutralize the Senate. Let them, confirming ambassadors would be a wonderful use of their time.
Thank you for that. And I think that's a very thorough answer to Kim's question there. We have a link-breaking question from Chris that I think is pretty provocative, another friend of mine from the Civics Network. DC statehood. Some people seem to think it would take a constitutional amendment, and others think a bill would accomplish this as well. What is your take?
Constitutional amendment or a bill?
We could go round and round in that. I don't know that it's worth taking the time to go through the technicalities. The political arguments in a way are more interesting, and Cynthia, has certainly thought and written about those.
Have I? What have I said about
DC state?
Right.
Why
well,
our son-in-law?
Well, wait. I mean, I think the question is how to get it to happen, how to get DC statehood to happen. I mean, as everybody knows, DC has a non-voting representative in the House, doesn't have anybody to speak for it in the Senate, and it doesn't control its own budget. We have a sly reference, and those of you who have either seen Hamilton on the stage someplace or heard the recording of it might know the song about the room where it happened. We have a sly reference to the room where it happened, and that is what happened was the decision to make the capital of the country the District of Columbia and to share space basically from Virginia and Maryland, but for it not to have any voting representation. But this is, I think, Chris's question is in terms of how to remedy that.
But let me come back to your initial question. My own view is if there was sufficient public opinion to support Congress simply passing a bill making DC a state, the way it made Texas a state, I believe that the admission of Texas to the Union was unconstitutional because Texas was a foreign country. It was not a territory. And I think that John Tyler and others were correct when they said that for Texas to come in, you needed a treaty. And you couldn't get 2/3 of the Senate to admit Texas. So they simply changed the rules. So if there really were public support, it's a scandal that the people living in our nation's capital, are taxed without representation, et cetera. And Congress admitted them through the ordinary majority vote process. It's hard for me to imagine, it's not impossible, but it's hard for me to imagine that the Supreme Court would make what would strike most people as highly technical and esoteric arguments as to why Congress didn't have that power. And if you don't have public opinion supporting it, then this really is an academic question in the pejorative sense of that term.
Thank you. Here's a question from Amit. He is wondering, how does your book address the flawed political structures that help cement deep social and justice inequities in the United States, racial divides, other inequities in the United States? How do you address that in your book? And I guess my follow-up question is, how do you think we should be addressing that now?
I want to be sure I heard the question. How does the book address social and inequities and social justice?
And racial divides.
And racial divides.
That were part of that, the flaws of the original Constitution, the 3/5 compromise, the treatment of Native Americans, et cetera.
Right. Actually, I would say that the foundation of the book has to do with race and slavery. We certainly talk about the 3/5 compromise and the extent to which there would not be a constitution but for agreement by northern states to compromise with southern states. Otherwise, there might well have been 2 or possibly 3 countries along what was, the eastern seaboard in the 1780s. The first chapter of the book, as I said, every chapter begins with a story. The very first chapter, the story is about a lynching in, I think, 1913. It relates to the Senate, in fact, and bicameralism. And we wanted to start the book with that story to emphasize the fact that racism and slavery have been hardwired into our system of government and decision making from the very beginning.
Well, the reason we start with the lynching is that the underestimated Warren Harding became the first president in our history following the racist Woodrow Wilson to support an anti-lynching bill. It didn't go anywhere because of the U.S. Senate. And the House of Representatives, which is far more representative, in fact, than the Senate, I think 3 or 4 separate times, doesn't matter, passed anti-lynching bills. And they died in the U.S. Senate because white Southern Democrats were able to filibuster it. It really is as simple as that. And to this moment, we don't have a federal anti-lynching bill because Rand Paul, the senator from Kentucky, refuses to let a bill come forward for a vote, even in today's Senate. And one could offer lots of other illustrations. The closest we came to getting rid of the Electoral College was in 1969. A constitutional amendment got through the House by more than 2/3. It then goes to the Senate, and it was blocked by a filibuster led by Sam Ervin from North Carolina and Strom Thurmond from South Carolina. Now, most people remember Ervin, if they remember him at all, as kind of the county sheriff during Watergate, when he was terrific. But he was also a segregationist senator from my home state of North Carolina, who never supported a civil rights bill and who correctly believed that getting rid of the Electoral College would be bad for the white Democratic South that then had just a hammerlock on who got all the electoral votes from the solid South. So we talk about these things recurrently in the book.
And Mary Ellen, you had a follow-up question, I think, related to that. Did we respond to that?
A little bit. You talked about the current lynching bill in Congress, but I guess my follow-up question is, what are some ways that you think that students or we as teachers can address that fault line in the Constitution? Like, what are the actions to take now to be a remedy to that?
I think it's really important, first of all, for students to understand the connections, the historical connections between the Constitution and racism. To become aware that it's not simply a current problem or that it didn't go away with the end of slavery. They need to know about Reconstruction, certainly, and the Reconstruction amendments. So first of all, I think historical knowledge and the connection between what's happening, the awareness is increasing now in the Constitution, is very important. And as I said, speak up. I really think that students writing about, talking about, acting on, protesting about, in ways that students can, so that more people become aware of these kind of innate inequities.
I think where you start, though, is actually making students aware that there are these fault lines. I mean, compare the remarkable response after the Parkland shooting, when kids all over the country really didn't need to be taught that bringing guns to schools are a problem. Whereas one of the things that I really regret is not only that the subject of civics has taken a lot of hits over the last 50 years in terms of the willingness of states to finance these programs and the like, but I think fewer and fewer civics courses teach the structural stuff because it's too often thought to be dull and boring. Guns are not dull and boring, but you might think that the presidential veto system is dull and boring, and it's not. You might think that Wyoming having the same voting power as California would be dull and boring, but let me assure you it's not. So I think that's where, in terms of what our book focuses on, the first thing is simply to make students aware of this.
Thank you. Thank you for that answer. We have a couple of questions actually about this next topic, constitutional issues related to delaying elections, from both Kevin and Stephen. And let me just give voice to Stephen's question. If I'm correct, I understand that the Constitution does not guarantee the right to vote, but rather the right to hold elections. What is to prevent a leader from preventing an election or restricting voter participation? I hear arguments from both sides about a change to the system, to delay elections. I'm looking for specifics to counter or support these claims and fears that people have. So could you address those concerns people have?
You should respond to that.
I mean, election day is arbitrary. Congress decided sometime in the 19th century that election day will be the first Tuesday after the first Monday. So there's nothing, maybe it's the first Tuesday, there's nothing, obvious. In fact, I think we don't really talk about this in the book, but it's kind of crazy in the modern world to have elections on a Tuesday. Most countries around the world have them on the weekend, and very often they're a couple of days, not only one day. But there is a congressional statute saying that election day is November 3rd this year. A president does not have the power to delay it. So it's really kind of the second part of your question that, practically speaking, is more important. What powers do states have to rig the election? And the fact is that states have a lot of power to do this. They can shut down voting places. I forget what the exact figures were in Milwaukee. I think it went down from something like 200 to 15 voting places. They can start restricting early voting, which my home state of North Carolina did. And there are all sorts of things that, from my perspective, unscrupulous state officials can do, and that's something to be very worried about. But I don't think, for all the things we have to worry about, I don't think that delaying or canceling the November election is really one of them.
Okay, thank you. On a bit more of a positive note, there are a lot of young people that are moving to lower the voting age to 16, especially for local municipal elections. Some have even talked about an amendment to do that for national elections. What are your thoughts about lowering the voting age to 16 for local or any type of election?
Yeah, this is a very interesting topic, and it's one that we talk about in the book, in fact, and in a blog that we wrote maybe 2 years ago. We raised the question of, can you run for office? What are the requirements for running for office? And what are the requirements, of course, for voting? Interestingly, Sandy and I have done a number of school visits, and not infrequently, we've asked the students that we're talking to whether they would support lowering the voting age in national elections to 16. Now, that has happened in at least one in counties. Mm-hmm. I think some counties have lowered the voting age to 16. And so we've asked them, what do you think of lowering the voting age for president to 16? Interestingly, the response has been largely negative. I think Sandy and I may be more in favor of it than young people are. Their concern is whether or not their peers would know enough. I mean, they have the kind of same fear that the framers had. Will the young people know enough to be able to make a wise choice?
Yeah, I think Cindy's absolutely right. I think it's one other thing that could serve as a really interesting focus of classroom discussion. I mean, we've had the 18-year-old vote since 1971, I think the 26th Amendment. I think what most political scientists would say is that the 18-year-old vote has been of almost no importance. And that is, enough 18-year-olds or 19, 20-year-olds, in fact, don't vote. And if they do vote, they tend simply to reflect the preferences of their parents. So it doesn't generate any really interesting political difference. To be completely frank, it's only in recent elections that the 19th Amendment turns out to be truly politically significant because of the gender gap. It turns out that women can be independent of their husbands, their fathers, and things like that. But the jury is still out about 19-year-olds or 18-year-olds. So I think it would be really, really interesting to ask students, let's say we have a 16-year-old vote, how many of them would in fact vote? I mean, if some kid says, I think it's crazy for a 16-year-old to vote, would that kid vote, or would he say, oh, I'm not going to vote because I don't know anything about it? But other 16-year-olds are on top of politics. What would they say?
All right, thank you. We're coming up to a few minutes left before 8 o'clock, so I want to give voice to this question right here. And, you know, both of you have encouraged us to get our students involved and active and use their voice to change the system, address the fault lines. But give me your best elevator pitch of what you would say to a young person who already feels his or her vote won't matter for reasons of race, economic status, political infrastructure, etc. What would your encouragement be to that young person?
Let me go first, because Cynthia probably would offer a more optimistic answer. I think it's very, very important to take kids seriously. And what I would say is that national elections in particular raise genuine questions, not necessarily because of rigging, though we can talk more about that, but the fact that all of the planets have to be in line for a single political party to capture both houses of the Senate, both houses of Congress, and the presidency, and even the Supreme Court, in order to pass really significant legislation. Whereas, and this is an important part of our book, that we compare the national constitution with state constitutions. If you look at state elections, it is very, very common that new brooms will sweep clean. For better and for worse, Republicans will sweep and replace Democrats, or Democrats will sweep and replace Republicans, and they will pass significant legislation. So kids ought to vote in state elections without a doubt, because they can see and feel what difference it makes. At the national level, it really is much more complicated.
I would say there are lots of ways to be counted. Voting is one of them. Encouraging family members to participate in voting and in the census is another one. I would make a distinction between showing up and being a leader. You only need so many leaders. And if a young person is not ready to take on the role of leadership, that doesn't mean that there aren't other people who are leaders about a cause that a young person cares about. Being a foot soldier is equally important. Those 3,000 to 4,000 children in Birmingham, that movement would not have worked if they all hadn't been there marching, protesting, putting their bodies, themselves, their ideas, their values on the line. And everybody can do that and make it matter.
Thank you so much. Well, with those inspiring words, I think we're going to throw it back to Elise for some closing comments, because we're coming up across to that 8 o'clock hour. And then maybe we'll have a little bit of time, if you two are willing to stay, to maybe answer a couple of questions that are out there in the after hours show. So Elise?
So thank you again, Cynthia and Sandy and Mary Ellen, and thank you to all the viewers for your great questions. For the viewers, in case you don't already have a copy, Fault Lines of the Constitution is available now in hardcover, paperback, ebook, and audiobook editions. And like Cynthia and Sandy mentioned earlier, there is a new graphic novel edition coming out September 22nd. We also have a variety of educational resources to use with the book, including a discussion guide, and various lesson guides on specific chapters and subjects like the Electoral College, recorded videos of Cynthia talking about chapters on emergency powers and the chapter on habeas corpus, and the co-authors blog where they post monthly about current events and the Constitution. So be sure to check out all of those great resources which are listed in that Google Doc. And just as a reminder that this video will be available after this event starting tonight. And like Mary Ellen mentioned before, the co-authors and Mary Ellen will stay behind for a few more minutes just to answer any final questions or comments. So thank you all again for attending this virtual event, and have a good rest of your night.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peachtree, Elise. Thank you, Mary Ellen.
Well, for those of you that are staying for the after hours show, do you have time for maybe 2 more questions that were not answered? Would that be okay?
Sure thing.
Sure.
Okay, great. Is political polarization a product of our Constitution? Sir, clearly your book shows that bipartisan politics creates a very divisive and counterproductive governing system, someone stated. Is this polarization a product of the Constitution?
To some extent, yes. In that the way we elect people in single-member districts, which is, the Constitution doesn't require it. It's a result of an 1842 statute by the House, and the Senate is in effect a single statewide district. It means that you don't get a cross-section of the public opinion and the role that primaries now play, that in many districts and some states, we know in advance who's going to win the election. It'll be the Democrat or Republican. It may be because of gerrymandering. It may be because of the way people sort themselves out. And so what people who want to be reelected are most attentive to is being primaried. And so Republicans are worried about being primaried from the right. Democrats are worried about being primaried from the left. So it may well be the case that the people who end up being elected to office are more extreme, so to speak, than the so-called median voter who's beloved by political scientists. So in that sense, the constitutional structure is important. In other ways, it really doesn't matter, because with issues like slavery or with issues like abortion, you have very, very sharp differences of opinion that will be present whatever the formal political structure.
Cynthia, is there anything you want to add about polarization being a byproduct of the Constitution?
I don't think I need to add to Sandy, except to say, of course, as probably everybody who's still with us knows, the framers wanted to avoid political parties.
Right.
So in that sense, they wanted to avoid factions. It is, and they tried to set up a system that would prevent factions, what we now think of as parties, and didn't succeed, which has made me think it may simply be human nature to have some divisiveness, some cohesion, but opposite each other. But I guess the question is, literally the question asked is, what about the degree of polarization that we have today? And it does seem to be increasingly intense. I don't know. You want to say something?
Yeah. I think Cynthia's absolutely right in emphasizing the importance of political parties as, frustrating and making irrelevant many of the framers' fondest hopes for what the United States turned out to be like. And here is why teaching the 12th Amendment, which almost never shows up in any syllabus, is worth it, because we really did get close to civil war in 1800 because of the failure of the original Electoral College, and the failure generated by their delusionary hope that we could avoid political parties. So what the 12th Amendment does is to recognize that we do have political parties. Political scientists can give all sorts of very good defenses for political parties, but there's no such thing as free lunch. And political parties themselves can become very powerful agents of polarization. And that's the world we live in right now.
There's one last question from Aaron that I really want to give voice to, that he asked early on. In regards to Electoral College votes, can you speak to the process of relocating felons from their home cities to remote locations for serving their terms that prevents them from voting, but does count them as residents in the location of prison? This was something that was on a recent NPR edition of Code Switch.
Yep.
Is this Aaron Hall?
Yes.
Hi, Aaron.
Yep. Huntsville, Texas gets undeserved representation in Congress. I mean, the Electoral College is a minor detail in this respect, because more important is that they get the benefit of all of the prisoners in the Huntsville prison who don't vote. And so the representative from Huntsville, and I don't know the prison locations around the country, San Quentin, I don't know in Illinois where the central prisons are. It is very often the case that the communities in which the prisons are located get this windfall in the state legislature, the national house. And there has been some litigation about this.
The same is true for college students in some cases.
Right. And the courts, by and large, have shrugged their shoulders. But it's a very, very real problem.
Thank you. Thank you for addressing that. That concludes the questions we have from participants. We do have a comment from Tracy that I'm going to give voice to because I'm a big advocate for this as well. I so enjoy the book. Looking forward to the graphic novel. Any word on a Spanish-speaking or ESL version for my students?
Thank you for bringing this up. I am going to share it again with the, you're talking about the Spanish version of the graphic novel?
Or the other book. I think they'll take whatever you got, Cynthia.
Okay, well, Elise, I hope you're listening to the possibility of a Spanish version of the text version of Fault Lines, and I will bring it up again with the editors at Macmillan for a Spanish version of the graphic novel. We share your desire for that. We have no control over it, but thank you for pushing for it.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Okay, bueno. So Elise, I'm going to throw it over to you to wrap things up today.
Okay, yes, definitely duly noted on the Spanish edition of the book. Thank you again, everybody who's still here. It looked like not very many people dropped off at the end of it. So just again, thank you very much for attending and for providing all of your wonderful questions. All the resources will be available, have been available, and again, the video will be available as well. So thank you all. Thank you, Cynthia, Sandy, and Mary Ellen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll end the broadcast now.
Okay.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Good night.